A nuclear submarine is a blind predator designed to kill without ever being seen. When it rises from the deep, it relies on a fragile chain of human decisions to ensure the surface is empty. On a bright February morning, that chain broke, and the ocean turned a classroom into a grave. To understand the tragedy of the Ehime Maru, one must first understand the deceptive nature of the water south of Oahu. The Pacific Ocean here is not merely a backdrop for postcards. It is a trackless, directionless wilderness that hides everything beneath a veneer of blue perfection. On the surface, the swells roll with a gentle, hypnotic rhythm, masking the immense depth and the violent currents that churn below. It is a space where a ship, even a large one, is nothing more than a speck of white paint on a canvas of indigo. For the sailors who navigate these waters, there is a constant, low-level awareness that the sea is indifferent to their presence. It does not care if a vessel is a warship or a fishing boat. It does not care about intentions or schedules. It simply exists, vast and heavy, waiting for a mistake. For the 35 people aboard the Japanese trawler Ehime Maru, the ocean on February 9th, 2001 felt less like a wilderness and more like a classroom. The ship was white and pristine, a 190-foot vessel owned by the government of the Ehime Prefecture in Japan. It was not a commercial factory ship designed to strip the sea of life for profit. It was a training vessel operated by the Uwajima Fisheries High School. Its mission was education. On board were 13 high school students, boys aged 16 and 17, who were nearing the end of a 74-day voyage. For many of them, this was their first true taste of the open sea. They had spent months learning the ancient and difficult trade of long-line tuna fishing. They had learned to read the wind, to handle the heavy, wet lines, and to stand a watch in the middle of the night when the only light came from the stars. The atmosphere on the ship was light, filled with the specific relief that comes at the end of a long journey. The hard work was largely done. They had caught their fish. They had navigated thousands of miles from Japan to Hawaii. Now they were just 9 miles south of Oahu, cleaning the ship and preparing for a final port call in Honolulu before the long steam home. The boys were scrubbing the decks, washing away the salt and the scales. Inside the galley, the cooks were preparing lunch. It was a Friday. The sun was shining, the air was warm. There was absolutely no sense of danger. They were in American waters, under the protection of the most powerful navy in the world. To the teachers and the captain of the Ehime Maru, the idea that a threat was lurking beneath them was inconceivable. They were safe. But safety at sea is an illusion maintained by vigilance, and 9 miles away, a machine built for war was preparing to shatter that illusion. The USS Greeneville was a Los Angeles-class attack submarine, a 6,000-ton cylinder of high-yield steel packed with the most advanced technology humanity had ever devised. She was a hunter-killer designed during the Cold War to track Soviet ballistic missile submarines and destroy them before they could launch the apocalypse. She was fast, silent, and lethal. Her crew was elite, trained to operate in a high-stress environment where a single open valve could mean death for everyone on board. However, on this particular morning, the Greeneville was not preparing for war. She was preparing for a show. The submarine was hosting a distinguished visitor embarkation. This was a public relations program designed to connect the Navy with the civilian world. 16 civilians, wealthy donors, business leaders, and sports writers were coming aboard for a day trip. The purpose was to impress them, to show them the capabilities of the tax-funded Leviathan, and to give them a taste of the submarine life. This mission profile introduced a subtle but dangerous shift in the psychology of the command. In a combat patrol, the priority is survival and stealth. In a distinguished visitor cruise, the priority is performance. The crew is not just operating the ship, they are performing a play. They are conscious of the audience. They want to look professional, sharp, and exciting. Commanding the Greeneville was Commander Scott Waddell. He was a charismatic, gregarious officer, beloved by his crew and respected by his superiors. He was known for his energy and his connection with his men. Waddell was the perfect captain for a VIP cruise. He knew how to talk to civilians, how to make them feel welcome in the cramped, alien environment of a nuclear submarine. He was a man who led from the front, confident in his abilities and confident in his boat. But confidence in the unforgiving environment of the ocean can be a liability. The Greeneville was behind schedule before she even left the pier. There had been delays in loading the guests. The lunch service for the VIPs was running late. These were minor administrative annoyances, the kind of friction that happens every day in the military. But in the precision world of submarine operations, friction creates heat. The schedule was tight. They had to get out to the operating area, conduct the demonstration maneuvers, and get back to Pearl Harbor in time for a dinner engagement. As the Greeneville cast off her lines and moved down the channel of Pearl Harbor, she was already fighting the clock. The crew was rushing. The rhythm of the day was compressed. And in the background, a technical gremlin was waiting to compound the human pressure. The submarine's analog video signal display unit, AVSDU, a repeater screen in the control room that allowed the captain to see the sonar data without stepping into the sonar shack, was broken. It had been malfunctioning for some time. In a combat deployment, this might have been a no-go item, a reason to stay in port until it was fixed. But for a VIP cruise, a day trip in local waters, it was deemed acceptable. The crew would work around it. They would rely on manual plotting and verbal reports. It was a decision that seemed reasonable at the dock, but it removed a critical layer of situational awareness from the man who would be making the life or death decisions. Commander Waddell would be flying blind, relying on what his crew told him rather than what he could see with his own eyes. As the submarine cleared the harbor and dived into the deep blue water south of Oahu, the two vessels, the Ehime Maru and the Greeneville, were operating in two different realities. The Ehime Maru was in the reality of peace. Her captain, Hisao Onishi, was worried about the schedule for cleaning the nets and the grades of his students. He was watching the weather, enjoying the calm seas. He had no sonar. He had no way of knowing what was happening beneath his keel. He trusted the charts and the rules of the road. The Greeneville was in the reality of a demonstration. The control room, usually a sanctuary of hushed voices and strict discipline, was crowded with civilians. They stood in the way of the watchstanders. They asked questions. They marveled at the periscope and the helm. The crew was polite, professional, but distracted. The psychological bandwidth of the watch team was being consumed by the need to be good hosts. The ocean between them was vast, deep, and empty. To a casual observer, the chances of two ships occupying the exact same point in space and time seemed infinitesimally small. The Pacific is millions of square miles, yet navigation is often a funnel. Ships converge on ports, they follow lanes. The Ehime Maru was drifting south, following the current. The Greeneville was speeding south, heading for her operating box. The stage was being set for a collision not just of steel, but of cultures. On one side, the Japanese training ship, built on a culture of meticulousness, hierarchy, and the slow, steady rhythm of the sea. On the other side, the American attack submarine, built on a culture of aggression, speed, and technological dominance. Commander Waddell wanted to give his guests a good show. He planned to execute a series of high-speed maneuvers, underwater turns, and depth changes that would demonstrate the agility of the 6,800-ton warship. These maneuvers, known as angles and dangles, are thrilling. The deck tilts 25 degrees, the hull groans, the sensation of speed is visceral. But to perform these maneuvers safely, the submarine needs a clear dance floor. The captain needs to know, with absolute certainty, that there are no other ships nearby. A submarine at high speed is deaf. The noise of its own water flow washes out the sonar. It cannot hear a fishing boat chugging along on the surface. So, the Greeneville had to check the area first. She had to listen. She had to build a contact picture. As the submarine moved deeper, the sonar operators in the darkened shack began to track the noise of the ocean. They heard the distant screws of merchant ships. They heard the biological crackle of shrimp. And they heard a faint, steady thrumming, a diesel engine turning a propeller at a slow, consistent rhythm. It was the Ehime Maru. The contact was designated S13. To the sonar team, it was just another line on a waterfall display, a trace of green light scrolling down a black screen. It was distant. It was moving slowly. It did not appear to be a threat. But sonar is not a camera. It does not show a picture of a ship. It shows a bearing, a direction. It does not inherently show distance. To determine how far away a ship is, the submarine must maneuver. It must turn, creating a target motion analysis, TMA leg, allowing the computers to triangulate the source of the sound. The Greeneville, however, was in a hurry. The lunch had run late. The guests were waiting for the show. The submarine did not spend hours refining the tracking solution. The crew made assumptions. They assumed the contact was far away. They assumed it was moving away. They assumed the ocean was as empty as they wanted it to be. Up on the surface, the students of the Uwajima Fisheries High School were finishing their cleaning duties. Some were looking out at the horizon, perhaps spotting the distant shape of Diamond Head on Oahu. They were teenage boys, full of life, thinking about souvenirs and girlfriends and the future. They did not know that 300 feet below them, a group of wealthy American tourists was squeezing into a control room, preparing to watch a submarine perform a stunt. The Greeneville was a war machine, but on this day it was being used as an amusement park ride, and the safety restraints, the rigid protocols, the checks and balances, the culture of paranoia that keeps submariners alive were being loosened one by one to accommodate the schedule. The ocean hides everything. It hides the depth, it hides the currents, and it hides the intentions of the men who sail it. As the Greeneville prepared to execute her maneuvers, the ocean was hiding the Ehime Maru in the one place the submarine captain wasn't looking, right in front of him. The collision was not inevitable. It required 1,000 small things to go wrong in a specific sequence. It required a broken monitor. It required a rushed lunch. It required a crowded control room. It required a captain who believed he knew more than his sensors were telling him. The students on the deck of the fishing boat felt the sun on their faces. The tourists in the control room felt the thrill of the dive. And the ocean, indifferent to them all, held them in its cold embrace, waiting for the moment when the two worlds would crash together. As the USS Greeneville cleared the channel buoys of Pearl Harbor and pointed her bow toward the open Pacific, the vessel was already operating with a handicap that would have grounded a commercial airliner. In the complex ecology of a nuclear submarine, the flow of information is as vital as the flow of hydraulic fluid. The captain, standing in the control room, is the central node of this network. He relies on data streams from navigation, sonar, and fire control to build a mental model of the world outside the hull. But on February 9th, 2001, the primary link between the captain's eyes and the ocean's reality was severed before the lines were even cast off. The device in question was the Analog Video Signal Display Unit, or AVSDU. To a layman, it looked like a standard computer monitor mounted in the overhead of the control room. To a submarine commander, it was a window. The AVSDU repeated the raw data from the sonar shack, allowing the captain to see the waterfall displays, the cascading green lines of acoustic energy, without leaving his command post. It allowed him to verify what his sonar operators were telling him. It was a tool of supervision, a way to double-check the math of the invisible war. But on the Greeneville, the AVSDU was dark. It had been malfunctioning for some time, a victim of the persistent maintenance backlog that plagues even the most advanced navies. In the pre-deployment briefing, the crew had noted the failure. In a wartime scenario, or perhaps under a more cautious command, this might have been a no-sail item. A blind captain is a dangerous captain. However, the mission that day was not combat, it was public relations. The pressure to perform for the distinguished visitors, to stick to the schedule, and to get the ship out to the operating box overrode the technical caution. Commander Scott Waddell made the decision to sail. He would rely on the old-school method, verbal reports from the sonar room and paper plots on the chart table. It was a decision born of confidence in his own experience and confidence in his crew. He believed that he didn't need the screen to understand the ocean. He was wrong. The loss of the AVSDU did not just remove a monitor, it removed the captain from the raw truth of the acoustic environment. It forced him to rely entirely on the interpretation of others. It turned the control room into an echo chamber where assumptions could not be easily challenged by hard data. As the submarine moved south, diving to a depth of 400 feet, the crew began the routine work of contact management. The ocean off Oahu is a busy highway. It is filled with tugs, barges, fishing boats, and inter-island ferries. To navigate safely, a submarine must track every noise-making object in its vicinity. In the sonar shack, a cramped, darkened compartment located just aft of the control room, sonar supervisor Patrick Seacrest and his team were listening to the Pacific. They were the ears of the ship. They wore headsets, their faces illuminated by the glow of the consoles. They began to pick up contacts. There were 3 primary signals of interest. They were designated S11, S12, and S13. S-12 was a tug towing a barge. S-13 was the Ehime Maru. To the sonar operators, these were just lines of bearing. Sonar tells you direction, bearing, but it does not inherently tell you distance, range, or speed. A loud ship far away sounds remarkably similar to a quiet ship close up. To solve this puzzle, to turn a bearing into a location, the submarine must perform target motion analysis, or TMA. TMA is a geometric process. The submarine must move. It travels on one course for a few minutes, listening to how the bearing of the target changes. Then it turns. It travels on a new course, a leg, and listens again. By comparing the rate of bearing change from two different angles, the fire control computer can triangulate the target's position, course, and speed. But to do this, the submarine has to turn. It has to clear its baffles. It has to weave through the water to build the picture. The Greeneville, however, was running late. The lunch for the civilians had dragged on. The transit to the exercise area had to be fast. Commander Waddle ordered the ship to head south at high speed. He did not order a zigzag search pattern. He drove the submarine in a straight line. This was the foundational error. By moving in a straight line, the Greeneville deprived its fire control computer of the geometric data needed to calculate range. The computer was starving for variables. It could see the bearing of S-13, the Ehime Maru, changing slowly, drifting down the side of the display. In the absence of hard triangulation, the human mind fills in the gaps with assumptions. The sonar team looked at the slow bearing drift of S-13 and assumed it was a distant merchant ship, perhaps 20 miles away, traveling safely on the horizon. The computer, fed with limited data, generated a firing solution that matched this assumption. It placed the Ehime Maru far away, well outside the danger zone. This was the false picture. It was a coherent, logical, and completely incorrect model of reality. In reality, the Ehime Maru was not 20 miles away. She was 9 miles away and closing. She was moving south, roughly parallel to the submarine's track. Because both ships were moving in similar directions at steady speeds, the bearing angle changed very little. To a passive sonar system moving in a straight line, a close ship moving parallel looks mathematically identical to a distant ship moving slowly. If the AVSDU in the control room had been working, Commander Waddle might have glanced up and seen the raw data. He might have noticed the signal strength or the quality of the sound and questioned the range estimate. He might have asked, "Are we sure about S-13? But the screen was black. He saw only what his fire control technician, Patrick Seacrest, told him. And Seacrest, working with bad geometry, was telling him that the ocean was clear. The atmosphere in the control room further degraded the crew's ability to focus. As the submarine sped south, the 16 civilians were invited into the nerve center of the vessel. They crowded into the small space standing between the periscope stand and the fire control consoles. They were excited, chatting, asking questions. Commander Waddle was in his element. He was narrating the operations, playing the role of the master and commander. He explained the systems, pointed out the gauges, and joked with the guests. The control room, usually a place of rigid, silent discipline, became a social gathering. This environment had a subtle, corrosive effect on the watchstanders. The officer of the deck, OOD, Lieutenant Junior Grade Michael Cohen, was a relatively junior officer. He was technically in charge of the ship's safety, but with the captain present and dominating the room, his authority evaporated. He became a spectator. He deferred to Waddle. He did not want to interrupt the captain's performance with minor concerns about sonar contacts. The fire control technician of the watch, FTOW, was stuck behind a wall of civilians. He had to crane his neck to see the plotting table. The physical crowding made it difficult to communicate with the sonar shack or the OOD. The flow of information was impeded by the physical presence of the guests. At 12:30 p.m., the Greeneville reached the operating area. The show was about to begin. Waddle planned to execute a series of dramatic maneuvers to impress the visitors. These included high-speed turns, steep angles, and rapid depth changes. To do this safely, the captain needed to know where S-13 was. He looked at the plot. The paper chart showed S-13 as a distant contact, labeled SD, surface distant. The solution looked stable. Based on the false picture they had built during the straight-line transit, the Ehime Maru was miles away, posing no threat. Waddle did not order a new TMA leg to verify the range. He did not slow down to clear the baffles. He accepted the data because it fit his desire to start the demonstration. He was fighting the clock, not the enemy. The submarine began the angles and dangles. The deck tilted sharply. The civilians squealed with delight as gravity pulled them against the bulkheads. The Greeneville accelerated to over 20 knots submerged. At high speed, a submarine goes deaf. The flow noise over the sonar dome increases, drowning out the subtle frequencies of other ships. The waterfall displays in the sonar shack became cluttered with static. The line for S-13 faded into the background noise. The sonar operator stopped tracking the Ehime Maru. They assumed, based on the earlier incorrect solution, that it was moving away from them. They dropped the track. In their minds, S-13 was history. It was a ghost that had passed. But S-13 was not history. The Ehime Maru was plodding steadily south, maintaining her course and speed. She was not 20 miles away. She was now within 5 miles. And the Greeneville, blind and deaf in her high-speed turns, was maneuvering directly into her path. The failure of the AVSDU was the first domino. The straight-line transit was the second. The crowding of the control room was the third. But the most dangerous failure was the psychological state of the crew. They had fallen victim to confirmation bias. They believed the ocean was empty because they needed it to be empty. They interpreted every piece of data to support the conclusion that it was safe to perform the stunts. Within the closed loop of the control room, a dangerous feedback loop was forming. The captain projected confidence. The crew, unwilling to look incompetent in front of the civilians or question their charismatic leader, validated that confidence. The officer of the deck assumed the captain had the full picture. The captain assumed the officer of the deck was tracking the contacts. The sonar room assumed the control room knew what it was doing. Everyone assumed someone else was watching the road. As the Greeneville finished her high-speed maneuvers, she prepared for the grand finale, the emergency main ballast tank blow. This is a maneuver where the submarine uses high-pressure air to blast the water out of its tanks, rocketing to the surface like a breaching whale. It is a violent, spectacular event, the highlight of any VIP cruise. To do it, the submarine must first go deep, to 400 feet. Then she must check the surface to ensure no ships are directly above her. Waddle ordered the ship to periscope depth to take a final look. This was the safety check. This was the moment where the false picture could be corrected. If they really looked, they would see the white hull of the fishing training ship looming in the distance. But the false picture was resilient. The crew was tired from the high-tempo maneuvers. The guests were anticipating the climax. The schedule was tight. The Greeneville rose to 60 feet. The broken screen of the AVSDU remained dark, offering no warning. The paper plot showed a clear ocean. The captain stepped up to the periscope. He was the only man in the world who could stop the collision. He gripped the handles. He was looking for a ship he believed was 20 miles away. He was not looking for a ship that was right on top of him. The stage was set for the final error. The broken technology had blinded them to the range. The procedural shortcuts had blinded them to the motion. And the social pressure of the VIP visit had blinded them to the risk. The Ehime Maru, carrying its cargo of high school students and teachers, was now less than 2 miles away. The gap was closing at a combined speed of nearly 30 knots. The classroom and the war machine were minutes from impact. The Greeneville leveled off at periscope depth. The ocean was calm, the sun was bright. It was a perfect day for a tragedy. By 1:00 p.m., the control room of the USS Greeneville had ceased to be the nerve center of a hunter-killer submarine and had transformed into a stage. The air was thick with the excitement of the 16 civilian guests squeezed into the space between the periscope stand and the fire control consoles. They were shoulder to shoulder with the watchstanders, a crowd of VIPs watching a performance of naval power. To them, the environment was thrilling. The red digital readouts, the hum of the electronics, the crisp shouts of the officers. They did not realize that their presence was slowly suffocating the operational discipline of the ship. Commander Scott Waddle was the master of ceremonies. He stood at the con, energetic and commanding, narrating the movements of the 6,800-ton vessel. He was demonstrating the agility of the Los Angeles class, a machine built to outmaneuver Soviet torpedoes, but now being used to generate G-forces for the entertainment of donors. The maneuver of the hour was angles and dangles. This is a stress test for the ship and the crew. The submarine accelerates to high speed, over 20 knots, and executes violent turns and depth changes. The deck tilts 25 degrees up, then 25 degrees down. Gravity shifts. Men have to lean at impossible angles to stay upright. The hull groans as the hydrodynamic forces twist the steel. For the civilians, it was a roller coaster ride in the dark. They laughed and grabbed onto the handrails as the floor dropped away beneath them. They watched the digital depth gauge spool up and down. It was a visceral display of American engineering, but for the men in the sonar shack, located just aft of the control room, angles and dangles was a blinding storm. Sonar relies on silence and stability. To track a contact, the submarine needs to move steadily so the hydrophones can listen without interference. When a submarine executes high-speed turns, the flow of water over the hull becomes turbulent. It creates a roar of white noise that washes out the sensors. The delicate frequencies of distant ships are buried under the avalanche of the submarine's own sound. As the Greeneville banked hard to port and accelerated, the waterfall displays in the sonar room turned into a mess of static. The green lines that represented the contacts, including S-13, the Ehime Maru, disappeared. The sonar operators were effectively blind. They marked the contacts as faded. In the logic of the drill, this was acceptable. They assumed that once the maneuvers were over and the ship slowed down, they would reacquire the targets. They assumed that S-13 was still a distant merchant ship, plodding away toward Honolulu, opening the range with every minute. They did not know that S-13 was not moving away. The Ehime Maru was maintaining a steady southerly course, and because the Greeneville was maneuvering wildly in a confined box, the geometry of the encounter was changing faster than the manual plot could update. Inside the control room, the atmosphere was becoming increasingly chaotic. The fire control technician of the watch, Patrick Seacrest, was responsible for managing the contact picture. He was the man who told the captain where the other ships were, but Seacrest was physically boxed in. The civilians were crowded around his console, blocking his view of the rest of the room. To speak to the officer of the deck or the captain, he had to shout over the heads of the guests or crane his neck around them. The flow of information, usually a seamless loop of data and acknowledgement, was becoming fragmented. Seacrest was updating the paper plot on the chart table, but he was working with bad data. The sonar was washed out. The AVSDU screen above him was broken. He was relying on his mental model of the ocean, a model that was frozen in time from 30 minutes ago. As the high-speed maneuvers concluded, the Greeneville slowed. The flow noise subsided. The sonar screens began to clear. In the sonar shack, a junior operator named Edward McGann noticed a new signal. It was a faint trace emerging from the background clutter. It was on a different bearing than the last known position of S-13. In a rigorous tracking scenario, the operator would have analyzed this signal carefully. He would have asked, is this S-13 closer and on a new bearing, or is it a new ship? But the tempo of the show was relentless. The ship was preparing for the next event. There was no time for deep analysis. McGann designated the contact as S-14. This was a critical, fatal classification error. By giving the contact a new number, the system treated it as a new, separate entity. The crew believed that S-13, the Ehime Maru, was still far away to the north. They believed S-14 was a new, distant ship to the northeast. In reality, S-13 and S-14 were the same ship. The Ehime Maru had moved, the Greeneville had moved, the geometry had shifted. The fishing vessel was now much closer, less than 4,000 yards, and closing. The signal-to-noise ratio was screaming a warning. The trace on the screen was strong. But because the Greeneville had been deaf for the last 20 minutes during the high-speed runs, the sonar team lacked the continuity of data to realize that the distant contact had become a close threat. They saw a dot, not a vector. Seacrest, in the control room, received the report of S-14. He added it to the plot. But because of the crowding, the noise, and the pressure of the VIP timeline, the urgency of the data was lost. The captain did not ask for a detailed analysis of S-14. He asked if the range was clear for the next maneuver. The next maneuver was the main event. Commander Waddle promised the guests an emergency deep, followed by an emergency main ballast tank blow. This maneuver simulates a casualty where the submarine is flooding and sinking. The crew drives the ship deep to 400 feet and then triggers the high-pressure air banks. The air blasts the water out of the ballast tanks in seconds. The submarine becomes positively buoyant like a balloon held underwater. It rockets to the surface, broaching the waves with a massive splash. It is the submarine equivalent of a wheelie. To execute this safely, the captain must ensure the surface is clear. He cannot shoot a 6,000-ton missile toward the surface if there is a ship in the way. Waddle ordered the ship to periscope depth to take a look. Prepare to come to periscope depth. The Greeneville leveled off at 60 feet. The time was 1:31 p.m. This was the final safety gate. If the crew looked and looked properly, they would see the Ehime Maru. The fishing ship was white, 190 feet long, and steaming under a bright sun. She should have been visible through the periscope, but the theater of war had distorted the procedures of the watch. Standard doctrine calls for a high search, a 360-degree sweep of the horizon at high magnification, followed by a low search at low magnification. This takes time. It requires the officer of the deck to walk the periscope around in a full circle, studying the waves, looking for smoke, masts, or hulls. Commander Waddle, however, was in a hurry. The lunch was late. The guests were waiting for the big finish. He decided to take the periscope himself. This was a breach of standard delegation. Usually, the officer of the deck conducts the safety sweep while the captain observes, but Waddle was the star of the show. He stepped up to the number 1 periscope. He grabbed the handles. Up scope! The hydraulic cylinder hissed. The heavy stainless steel tube slid up from the well. Waddle pressed his eye to the optic. The control room went silent. The civilians watched, mesmerized. The crew waited. Waddle spun the periscope. He looked forward. He looked aft. He scanned the horizon. No close contacts, he announced. I hold no visual contacts. He cycled the handles. Downscope. The search had lasted less than 80 seconds. In that minute and a half, Scott Waddle had failed to see a 190-foot ship that was less than 2,000 yards away. How is this possible? The inquiry would later reveal a convergence of bad luck and bad procedure. The Greeneville was rolling slightly in the swell. Waves were washing over the lens. Waddle was using the periscope in low-power mode, which offers a wider field of view but makes distant objects look smaller. But the primary reason was likely the false picture in his mind. His fire control team had told him the contacts were distant. His sonar team had dropped the track on S-13. He expected to see an empty ocean, so his brain processed the visual data to confirm that expectation. Furthermore, the Ehime Maru was painted white. Against the haze of the horizon and the white caps of the waves, a white ship can blend in, a phenomenon known as camouflage by accident. But there was another factor. Waddle did not conduct a full, methodical 360-degree scan. He scanned the sectors where he thought the contacts were. He scanned the sectors where the computer said S-13 and S-12 were. He did not look hard enough at the sector where S-13 actually was. He lowered the scope. The safety check was complete. In his mind, the box was checked. The ocean was empty. The stage was set for the grand finale. Officer of the deck, take her down. Emergency deep. The order was given. The Greeneville angled her bow down. She slipped away from the surface, diving toward the 400-foot starting line for the emergency blow. As the water closed over the periscope shears, the link to the surface was severed. The Greeneville was now committed. She was a loaded gun, cocked and aimed at the sky. In the sonar shack, the junior operator, McGann, was staring at his screen. The line for contact S-14, the new contact, was getting brighter. It was getting wider. The signal-to-noise ratio was spiking. This meant the source of the sound was getting closer. McGann felt a spike of anxiety. The captain had just looked and said it was clear. The fire control team said it was distant. But his ears were telling him something else. The sound was loud. He turned to his supervisor. Sierra 14 is closing, he said. But the supervisor was busy. The ship was diving. The control room was calling for depth reports. The warning didn't travel. It died in the few feet between the sonar console and the doorway. In the control room, the excitement was peaking. The civilians were bracing themselves. Waddle was smiling. All ahead full. Maneuvering, cavitate, Waddle ordered. This order authorized the engine room to spin the propeller so fast that it created bubbles, cavitation. Usually this is avoided because it creates noise, but for an emergency blow, speed is essential. The Greeneville reached 400 feet, the hull compressed, the pressure built. Emergency blow! The chief of the watch threw the levers. High-pressure air stored at 4,500 psi roared into the ballast tanks. It was a deafening sound, a thunderous whoosh that vibrated through the soles of the crew's shoes. The submarine shudders as tons of water were expelled. She became light. She became a rocket. The bow lifted, the angle gauge climbed, 10 degrees up, 20 degrees up, 25 degrees up. The Greeneville was now traveling vertically through the water column at more than 20 knots. She was a 6,000-ton steel shark breaching for the kill. Above her, the Ehime Maru was plodding along at 11 knots. The students were finishing their lunch. The crew was thinking about Honolulu. They did not hear the roar of the air. They did not see the shadow rising from the deep. They were floating in the center of the bullseye. The theater of war had reached its climax. The audience in the control room was thrilled by the sensation of the ascent. They felt the G-force. They felt the power of the U.S. Navy. They did not know that the show was about to end with a collision that would destroy lives, ruin careers, and shake the alliance between two nations. The Greeneville raced toward the surface. The sonar was deafened by the roar of the blow. The periscope was down. The captain was blind. 300 feet, 200 feet, 100 feet. The gap closed to zero. The Greeneville was not coming up empty. She was coming up directly beneath the engine room of the Ehime Maru. The warnings had not landed. The screen was broken. The eyes had failed. Now, only the steel remained. At 1:43 p.m., the Pacific Ocean south of Oahu became a vertical highway for a 6,000-ton projectile. The USS Greeneville was no longer navigating. She was ballistic. The high-pressure air from the emergency banks had displaced thousands of tons of seawater in seconds, transforming the submarine from a negatively buoyant vessel into a cork held underwater. The laws of physics took over, driving the ship upward with an acceleration that pinned the crew to the deck plates. In the control room, the sensation was electric. The civilians, gripping the handrails, felt the visceral power of nuclear propulsion and compressed air. The deck angle was steep, nearly 25 degrees up bubble. To the guests, this was the thrill they had been promised. It was the e-ticket ride, a display of military might that defied gravity. But to a physicist, the Greeneville was a blind missile. As the submarine accelerated past 20 knots vertically, the flow noise over the sonar dome became a deafening roar. The sensors were washed out. The periscope was retracted. Commander Waddell had visually cleared the surface minutes earlier, but minutes in a dynamic ocean are an eternity. He was betting his ship and his career on a snapshot of the past, assuming that the future would remain empty. Above them, the Ehime Maru was steaming south at a steady 11 knots. The students on the deck were finishing their lunch break. The engine room crew was monitoring the diesels. The ship was stable, predictable, and utterly unaware that the water beneath its keel was about to erupt. The gap closed, 400 feet, 300 feet, 200 feet. The geometry of the collision was a tragedy of precision. If the Greeneville had surfaced 100 yards to the left or right, the Ehime Maru would have been rocked by a massive swell, perhaps swamped, but likely intact. Instead, the submarine was rising on a vector that intersected perfectly with the engine room of the fishing vessel. At 1:43:15 p.m., the Greeneville broached. The event happened faster than human reaction time. The bow of the submarine broke the surface first, exploding out of the water in a geyser of white foam. The immense steel cylinder of the hull followed, shedding thousands of gallons of seawater. Then the rudder struck. The Greeneville's rudder is a massive reinforced steel fin located on the dorsal side of the ship aft of the sail. It is built to withstand the hydrodynamic forces of high-speed turns. As the submarine rose beneath the Ehime Maru, the rudder acted like a guillotine blade. It sliced into the hull of the Japanese ship just aft of the engine room. The impact was not a collision in the traditional sense. It was a dissection. The force of the rising submarine lifted the 190-foot fishing vessel bodily out of the water. The Ehime Maru shuddered violently, her keel groaning as the submarine's steel cut through the plating, the frames, and the machinery spaces. For the students on the deck of the Ehime Maru, the world turned upside down. One moment they were standing on a stable platform, the next they were thrown into the air. A shock wave traveled through the ship, shattering glass, buckling bulkheads, and knocking men off their feet. A deafening metallic screech, the sound of steel tearing steel, drowned out the roar of the ocean. Then the submarine fell back. The Greeneville, having expended her upward momentum, crashed back into the sea. The Ehime Maru dropped with her, slamming back into the water with a force that snapped fuel lines and shattered the electrical grid. Inside the Greeneville, the collision felt different. It was a single, violent shudder that ran through the entire length of the ship. It felt as if the submarine had hit a concrete wall. The civilians were thrown against the consoles. Tools clattered to the deck. For a split second, there was silence in the control room. The joy of the ride evaporated, replaced by a cold, primal confusion. "What was that?" someone asked. Commander Waddle stood at the con, his face draining of color. He knew what a submarine surfacing felt like. It was rough, yes, but it was fluid. This was hard. This was kinetic. "Jesus," Waddle whispered. The first thought in the mind of the crew was a mechanical failure. Had the Fairwater planes snapped off? Had they hit a submerged container, or had they hit a whale? "Sound the collision alarm," Waddle ordered. The alarm blared, bong, bong, bong. It is a sound that signals an existential threat to the ship. "Report, damage control." Reports began to flow in. "Loud noise forward. No flooding. Propulsion intact." The Greeneville was a warship built to survive depth charges. A collision with a 500-ton fishing boat was physically traumatic but structurally survivable for the submarine. Her high-yield steel pressure hull had barely noticed the impact, but Waddle needed to know what he had hit. "Up scope!" He grabbed the handles of the #1 periscope. The hydraulic cylinder hissed. He pressed his eye to the optic. The view through the lens was a nightmare. Less than 100 yards away, the Ehime Maru was dead in the water. She was listing heavily to port. Black smoke was pouring from her funnel, and she was sinking. "We hit a ship," Waddle announced. The words hung in the air of the control room, heavy and final. "We hit a ship." The civilians stared at him. The show was over. The reality of what they had just done crashed down on them. They were not spectators anymore. They were participants in a disaster. On the Ehime Maru, the situation had bypassed emergency and gone straight to catastrophic. The rudder of the Greeneville had slashed open the engine room. The Atlantic Ocean was rushing into the ship through a gash the size of a garage door. The inflow was massive, uncontrollable. The lights went out immediately as the generators were flooded. The ship plunged into darkness, the air filled with the smell of diesel fuel and the scream of escaping steam. In the engine room, the 3 crew members on watch never stood a chance. The water hit them with the force of a train. They were swept away, trapped in a maze of pipes and machinery that was rapidly filling with the Pacific. In the galley, the cook was thrown across the room. In the cabins, students who had been resting were tossed from their bunks. The ship began to settle by the stern. The angle was steep. Gravity, which had been a constant, was now shifting. The floor became a wall. Captain Onishi, on the bridge of the Ehime Maru, tried to grab the wheel, but the helm was dead. He looked aft. He saw the stern disappearing underwater. He realized instantly that the ship was lost. "Abandon ship! Abandon ship!" He shouted the order, but the public address system was dead. He had to rely on shouting. The crew began to scramble for the exits. But the Ehime Maru was not sinking slowly. She was plummeting. The sheer size of the hole in her bottom meant that she had lost all buoyancy in the aft section. Back on the Greeneville, the crew was paralyzed by the sight in the periscope. Waddle watched the ship listing. He saw men in orange life vests jumping into the water. He saw a life raft inflate. The instinct of a mariner is to help, but a submarine is a terrible rescue platform. It has no flat decks near the waterline. It has no boats to launch. Its round hull is slippery and dangerous in a swell. Waddle faced a new dilemma. If he moved the Greeneville closer, the massive hull of the submarine could crush the swimmers or swamp the life rafts. The wake from his propeller could drown the survivors. "Radio room, distress call. Contact Coast Guard immediately." The radio man punched out the message. "Mayday, Mayday, USS Greeneville, involved in collision. Vessel sinking." The timeline of the sinking was merciless. On the Titanic, it took 2 hours and 40 minutes. On the Lusitania, 18 minutes. The Ehime Maru sank in 5 minutes. 5 minutes. That is not enough time to organize an evacuation. It is not enough time to launch boats. It is barely enough time to realize you are dying. For the students trapped in the lower decks, the world became a terrifying confusion of rushing water and darkness. The ship rolled. Furniture slid across the decks, blocking doors. The pressure built. On the surface, the Ehime Maru raised her bow toward the sky, a final gesture of agony. Then she slid backward. The water closed over the bridge. The funnel vanished. The name on the bow disappeared. She was gone. All that remained was a slick of diesel fuel, a scattering of debris, and the bobbing heads of the survivors. Waddle lowered the scope. He looked at his crew. The control room was silent. The civilians were weeping. The sonar operators were staring at their blank screens, realizing that the distant merchant S-13 had been right on top of them. The collision had been a physical event, a transfer of kinetic energy. But the sinking was a moral event. The Greeneville, a machine costing nearly $1 billion, crewed by the elite of the U.S. Navy, carrying the VIPs of American society, had just killed a school ship. The blind ascent was over. The submarine was on the surface. But the eyes of the crew were now wide open, staring at a tragedy they had created with their own hands. The transition from the thrill of the emergency blow to the horror of the aftermath was instantaneous. The adrenaline that had fueled the theater of war now turned sour in their veins. There was no enemy to fight. There was no torpedo to evade. There was only the oil on the water and the knowledge that 9 people were missing. As the Greeneville rocked in the swell, the Coast Guard helicopters were scrambling from Barber's Point. The rescue swimmers were suiting up. The machinery of salvation was winding up. But it was too late for the ship. The Ehime Maru was already beginning her long fall to the bottom of the Pacific, 2,000 feet down. She was taking the engine room crew, the cook, and 4 of the students with her. The collision had shattered the hull, but it had also shattered the myth of competence that surrounded the submarine force. The day a submarine came up blind had reached its nadir. The blindness was no longer technological, it was existential. They had looked, but they had not seen, and now they could not look away. The physics of a collision at sea are usually measured in force and displacement, but the sinking of the Ehime Maru was measured in seconds. When the rudder of the USS Greeneville sliced through the engine room of the Japanese training ship, it did not just breach the hull, it stopped time for the 35 people on board. One moment they were living in the slow, rhythmic world of a long voyage home. The next, they were thrown into a chaotic fight for survival where the ocean was rushing in faster than they could think. Inside the Ehime Maru, the impact was a deafening, metallic scream. The steel rudder of the submarine, reinforced to steer a 6,000-ton vessel at 30 knots, acted like a massive blade. It cut through the bottom plating of the fishing ship with terrifying ease, severing hydraulic lines, smashing electrical conduits, and opening a hole the size of a bus directly into the engineering spaces. For the 3 crewmen on watch in the engine room, Chief Engineer Toshimitsu Nakata, First Engineer Hiroshi Makazawa, and crewman Hirotaka Sagawa, there was no escape. The Pacific Ocean entered the compartment as a solid wall of water. The force of the inrush was so violent that it likely killed them instantly or pinned them against the machinery before they could take a breath. The lights shorted out in a shower of sparks, plunging the room into darkness, followed immediately by the silence of absolute flooding. They were the first casualties of the collision, erased by the sheer kinetic energy of the submarine's ascent. In the spaces above, the violence was less immediate but no less terrifying. The galley, where the crew was preparing the next meal, was thrown into chaos. Pots, pans, and boiling water flew across the room. In the cabins, students who had been resting were tossed from their bunks. The ship shuddered violently, a convulsion of steel that knocked men off their feet and left them scrambling for purchase on a deck that was already beginning to tilt. The reaction of the survivors was driven by instinct and drill. Captain Hisao Onishi, standing on the bridge, felt the ship lurch. He grabbed the helm, but the wheel spun uselessly in his hands. The rudder linkage was gone. He looked aft and saw the impossible. The stern of his ship was disappearing. The water was not creeping up, it was rushing over the gunwales. Abandon ship! Abandon ship! The order was shouted, passed man to man because the public address system was dead. But the timeline for abandonment had been compressed to the point of absurdity. In maritime history, most sinkings allow for a period of realization and reaction. The Titanic took 2 hours and 40 minutes to sink. The Lusitania took 18 minutes. The Ehime Maru would be gone in 5 minutes. 5 minutes is not enough time to launch a lifeboat. It is not enough time to gather supplies. It is barely enough time to find a life jacket. The students, boys of 16 and 17, scrambled out of the cabins and onto the aft deck. The angle of the ship was increasing rapidly. The stern was dragging the vessel down, pulling the bow high into the air. The teak deck, slick with seawater, and the diesel fuel that was erupting from the ruptured tanks became a slide. Panic began to set in. The students were trained in fishing, not in surviving a catastrophic collision with a nuclear submarine. They looked for their teachers. They looked for the life rafts. 3 of the ship's life rafts automatically deployed. The hydrostatic releases triggered as the water washed over the canisters. The rafts inflated with a hiss, popping open like bright orange flowers in the gray water. But the ship was sinking so fast that the rafts were in danger of being dragged down with it, fouled in the rigging, or sucked into the vortex of the plunging hull. The air around the ship filled with the smell of diesel. The fuel tanks, ripped open by the submarine's rudder, were venting thousands of gallons of heavy marine oil into the water. It coated the surface in a thick, black sludge. It stung the eyes. It made the railings impossible to grip. As the water reached the main deck, the men began to jump. They did not dive gracefully. They tumbled. They leaped into the oil-slicked ocean, gasping as the cool water hit them. They swam frantically away from the hull, terrified of the suction. Inside the ship, the situation was a nightmare of entrapment. 4 of the students, Yusuke Terata, Katsuya Nomoto, Takeshi Mizuguchi, and Toshiya Sakushima, never made it to the deck. They were likely trapped in their cabins or in the passageways, confused by the darkness and the sudden tilt of the world. 2 teachers, Hiroshi Makizawa and Jun Nakata, were also missing. The water rushed into the corridors. Furniture slid down the halls, blocking doors. The air pockets compressed. The sounds of the ship breaking up, the groaning of bulkheads, the shattering of glass were deafening. On the surface, the survivors watched in horror as their home died. The Ehime Maru reached a vertical angle. The bow pointed straight at the sky, hanging there for a heartbeat, a white tombstone marking the spot. Then, with a rush of escaping air and a swirl of foam, she slid backward. She vanished. The ocean closed over the spot where the ship had been. The violence of the impact and the sinking was replaced by a sudden, shocking silence, broken only by the coughing of the men in the water and the slap of the waves. 35 people had been on board. Now there were heads bobbing in the oil. From the bridge of the USS Greeneville, a few hundred yards away, the view was one of helpless devastation. Commander Scott Waddell and his crew watched the ship disappear. They saw the life rafts. They saw the survivors struggling in the sludge. The instinct of any sailor is to help, to pull the drowning men from the sea. But a nuclear submarine is a terrible rescue platform. It has no flat decks near the waterline. Its hull is a rounded cylinder of wet, slippery steel coated in algae. In the swell of the Pacific, the massive bulk of the submarine acted like a hammer. If Waddell moved the Greeneville closer, the rolling hull could crush the swimmers or capsize the fragile life rafts. The wake from the propeller could drown them. Waddell ordered the crew to the deck, but they were powerless. They threw lines, but the distance was too great. They could only watch. The submarine, the master of the deep, was impotent on the surface. The machine built to kill could not save. "Radio room, update the distress call," Waddell ordered, his voice tight. "Advise Coast Guard we have survivors in the water. Fuel spill, situation critical." The call went out to the Coast Guard station at Barber's Point. The response was immediate. Search and rescue helicopters and cutters were scrambled. But the distance was 9 miles. It would take time the men in the water might not have. The survivors of the Ehime Maru were fighting a new battle. They were coated in diesel fuel. The oil got into their eyes, blinding them. It got into their mouths and lungs, causing them to retch. It made their skin slippery, making it impossible to hold on to each other or the sides of the rafts. They huddled together in the water and in the rafts. The teachers tried to count the students. They shouted names. "Yusuke! Katsuya!" There was no answer. The count came up short. 9 people were missing. The Coast Guard helicopters arrived within 45 minutes. The noise of the rotors was the first sign of hope. The rescue swimmers dropped into the water, cutting through the oil slick with the efficiency of professionals. They began to haul the survivors into baskets, winching them up to the hovering aircraft. It was a chaotic, desperate operation. The swimmers had to fight the oil, the waves, and the exhaustion of the victims. Some of the Japanese sailors were in shock, unable to move. They had to be physically lifted. One by one, 26 men were pulled from the ocean. They were wet, shivering, and chemical burned, but they were alive. They were flown to hospitals in Honolulu, leaving the scene of the disaster behind. But 9 men remained. The Coast Guard cutters arrived and began a grid search. They looked for hours. They found debris, pieces of wood, personal effects, a fishing buoy, but they did not find the missing. The engine room crew was gone. The 2 teachers were gone, and the 4 students were gone. As the sun began to set on February 9th, the reality of the tragedy solidified. The Ehime Maru was lying on the bottom of the Pacific 2,000 feet down. The 9 missing people were likely trapped inside her. Back on the Greeneville, the submarine turned toward Pearl Harbor. The VIPs were silent. The Distinguished Visitor Program had ended in the worst possible way. The civilians who had come for a thrill were now witnesses to a negligent homicide. They sat in the wardroom, traumatized, while the crew navigated the boat back to port. Commander Waddell stood on the bridge as the submarine entered the channel. He knew his career was over. He knew that he would face a court of inquiry, perhaps a court-martial. But the weight on his soul was heavier than the legal jeopardy. He was the man who had given the order. He was the man who had looked through the periscope and seen nothing. The 5 minutes in the dark were over for the ship, but for the families of the victims, the darkness was just beginning. The news was flashing across the Pacific to Japan. In the town of Uwajima, parents were waking up to the report that their children were missing. The school was in chaos. The collision had been a physical event, a transfer of kinetic energy from a submarine to a ship. But the sinking was a moral event. It revealed the asymmetry of the encounter. The Greeneville was a 6,000-ton warship designed to survive depth charges and torpedoes. It had hit a fishing boat. The submarine suffered scratches. The fishing boat was obliterated. The collateral damage of the peacetime Navy was no longer an abstract concept. It had names and faces. It was teenagers who liked soccer and video games. It was teachers who wanted to show their students the world. The ocean had swallowed the evidence of the collision, hiding the wreckage in the deep. But it could not hide the consequences. The oil slick remained on the surface, a rainbow stain marking the spot where the classroom had died. As the Greeneville tied up at the pier, the media vans were already waiting. The diplomatic firestorm was igniting. The Prime Minister of Japan was demanding answers. The President of the United States was apologizing. But apologies could not bring the ship back. They could not pump the air back into the lungs of the boys trapped in the cabins. The tragedy of the Ehime Maru was not just that it sank, it was how unnecessary it was. It was a disaster born of hubris, haste, and a broken monitor. It was a reminder that in the high-stakes world of nuclear submarines, there is no such thing as a small mistake. Every error is magnified by the power of the machine. The submarine had come up blind, and in doing so, it had closed the eyes of 9 people forever. The 5 minutes of the sinking were the culmination of a chain of errors that began hours before, but they were the minutes that would define the rest of the lives of everyone involved. The ocean was quiet again. The waves rolled over the coordinates, but down in the dark, the Ehime Maru was settling into the silt, a new wreck in an old sea waiting for the divers who would eventually come to retrieve the dead. The collision between the USS Greeneville and the Ehime Maru was a momentary event, a violent intersection of steel that lasted mere seconds. But the shockwave it generated rippled across the Pacific for years, transforming from a physical disaster into a geopolitical crisis. In the days following the sinking, the relationship between the United States and Japan, allies bound by treaties and history, was strained to a breaking point not seen since the trade wars of the 1980s. The anger in Japan was visceral. The image of an American nuclear submarine, a machine of immense power and lethality, Surfacing beneath a high school training ship and then failing to rescue the students was a narrative that tapped into deep historical wounds. It reinforced the perception of American military arrogance. The fact that civilians were at the controls of the submarine during the maneuvers added a layer of grotesque negligence to the tragedy. It looked as though the U.S. Navy was treating the ocean as a playground, with lethal consequences for anyone who got in the way. Commander Scott Waddell became the face of this failure. When the Navy convened a court of inquiry at Pearl Harbor in March 2001, the world watched. The courtroom was packed with media, naval officers, and the grieving families of the Japanese victims who had flown to Hawaii to demand answers. Waddell's testimony was a study in command responsibility. He did not plead the Fifth Amendment. He did not blame his crew. He stood before the admirals and the families and admitted that he had failed. He admitted that the periscope search was rushed. He admitted that he had prioritized the schedule over the safety of the ship. He broke down in tears, apologizing directly to the families in a moment of raw, unscripted humanity that is rare in military tribunals. But apologies do not bring back the dead, and they do not satisfy the demands of justice. The inquiry revealed the systemic rot inside the Greeneville. It exposed the broken AVSDU monitor, the crowded control room, the false picture built on bad sonar data, and the culture of haste that had permeated the command. It painted a picture of a crew that was too confident, too relaxed, and too eager to please. The verdict, however, was controversial. The admirals decided not to court-martial Commander Waddell. They ruled that while his actions were negligent, they were not criminal in the sense of malicious intent. He was found guilty of dereliction of duty and subjecting a vessel to a hazard. His punishment was administrative, a letter of reprimand, and forced retirement. He was allowed to keep his rank and his pension. To the families of the victims, and to many in Japan, this felt like a betrayal. A Japanese captain who sank a ship through negligence would likely face prison. The American captain walked away. The perceived leniency fueled a sense of injustice that threatened the diplomatic alliance. To heal this wound, the United States government made a decision that was unprecedented in the history of maritime salvage. Usually, when a ship sinks in deep water, it stays there. The ocean is the grave. But the Japanese culture places immense importance on the recovery of remains. The families wanted their sons home. So, the U.S. Navy decided to raise the Ehime Maru. The engineering challenge was staggering. The ship lay at 2,000 feet. It weighed 800 tons. It was damaged, fragile, and filled with fuel. To lift it would require technology that had barely been invented. The cost would be astronomical, eventually totaling over $60 million. But the cost of not raising it, the political cost, was higher. In the summer of 2001, a massive salvage operation began. The Navy contracted the Rockwater II, a specialized diving support vessel equipped with dynamic positioning and heavy lift cranes. The plan was not to lift the ship directly to the surface, which might cause it to break apart, but to lift it gently and move it underwater to a shallow anchorage where divers could enter safely. It was a delicate, high-tech funeral procession. Remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, descended to the wreck. They looped massive steel cables under the hull of the Ehime Maru. Slowly, gently, the ship was lifted from the seabed. Suspended beneath the Rockwater II, the fishing vessel was carried 12 miles to a shallow shoal near the Honolulu airport. There, in 115 feet of water, she was set down. Now, the human work began. Navy divers from the Mobile Diving and Salvage Unit 1 entered the water. The visibility was poor. The water was murky. The interior of the ship was a tangled ruin of nets, furniture, and jagged steel. They moved through the corridors of the sunken school. They found the classrooms. They found the cabins. They found the personal effects of the teenagers, Game Boys, letters, fishing lures, and they found the bodies. Over the course of a month, the divers recovered 8 of the 9 missing people. They found the engine room crew at their stations. They found the teachers. They found the students. Only one body, that of the student Takeshi Mizuguchi, was never found. The ocean kept him. The recovery of the remains allowed for closure. The families were able to cremate their loved ones and bring them home to Uwajima. The anger did not vanish, but the gesture of the recovery, the willingness of the United States to spend millions and risk the lives of its own divers to return the dead, helped to bridge the chasm. Once the recovery was complete, the Ehime Maru had to be laid to rest for the final time. She could not be scrapped, she was too damaged, too soaked in oil and tragedy. On November 25, 2001, the ship was lifted again. She was towed out to deep water, far from the coast, into the abyss of the Pacific Trench. The lift cables were cut. The Ehime Maru began her final descent, spiraling down into 6,000 feet of water. She settled in the dark, a permanent memorial to the 9 lives lost. The Greeneville returned to service. The damage to her rudder was repaired. The AVSDU screen was fixed. But the submarine was marked. She became a problem boat in the eyes of the fleet, a vessel haunted by her history. Commander Waddell retired, becoming a public speaker on leadership and failure, living with the weight of the accident every day. The legacy of the Ehime Maru disaster reshaped the U.S. Navy. The Distinguished Visitor Program was overhauled. Civilians were banned from the control room during critical maneuvers. The procedures for periscope searches were tightened. The culture of performance, the idea that a warship should be used to entertain donors, was dismantled. The Navy relearned the lesson that Rickover had taught decades earlier. The ocean is not a stage. It is a hostile environment that demands absolute respect. Confidence is not a safety system. Today, at the Kakako Waterfront Park in Honolulu, there is a memorial. It is a simple structure, 9 granite blocks, one for each of the victims, surrounding an anchor from the Ehime Maru. It looks out over the ocean toward the spot where the collision happened. Visitors often stand there, watching the ships leave Pearl Harbor. They see the massive aircraft carriers and the sleek submarines moving out to sea. They look powerful. They look invincible. But the story of the Greeneville is a reminder of the fragility behind the power. It reminds us that these machines are operated by humans, and humans are flawed. We get tired, we get distracted, we make assumptions, we trust screens that are broken and logs that are wrong. The day a submarine came up blind was not an anomaly, it was a warning. It exposed the danger of complacency in a high-tech world. It showed that even the most advanced sensors can be defeated by a skipped step in a checklist. The ocean forgives nothing. It does not care if you are a superpower or a high school. It does not care if you are on a VIP cruise or a fishing trip. If you make a mistake, the water is waiting. As the sun sets over the memorial, the names of the 9 are illuminated. Hiroshi Makizawa Jun, Nakata Toshimitsu, Nakata Hirotaka, Sagawa Yusuke Terata Katsuya Nomoto, Takeshi Mizuguchi Toshiya Sakushima Katsuya Nomoto. They are the silent witnesses to the cost of arrogance. They are the reason that today, when a submarine captain raises the periscope, he looks twice. He sweeps the horizon not just for enemies, but for the innocent. He remembers that the sea is not empty, and that the blind ascent is a gamble that no one can afford to win. The story of the USS Greeneville and the Ehime Maru is a tragedy of proximity. 2 vessels from different worlds, one of war, one of peace, found themselves in the same square mile of a vast ocean. The collision was a statistical improbability made inevitable by human error. It challenges our faith in technology. The Greeneville had the best sonar in the world, yet she hit a ship that was making noise. She had the best radar, yet she saw nothing. The failure was not in the hardware, it was in the wetware, the minds of the men who interpreted the data. There is a profound sadness in the innocence of the victims. The students were learning to harvest the sea, the submariners were learning to dominate it. The collision destroyed the innocence of both. As we leave the story, we are left with the image of the open ocean. It looks calm, it looks empty. But we know now that beneath the surface there are giants moving in the dark. And we know that the only thing keeping them from crashing into our world is the discipline of the men inside. When that discipline fails, the giants stumble. And when giants stumble, the earth shakes. If this deep dive into the hidden history of the Navy and the complexities of maritime disaster meant something to you, we'd be honored to have you with us again. Until next time, stay curious and take good care.